So that notification.
All right, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us both in person and online. We were happy to have a Be the Change speaker series again tonight. We were here about a week and a half ago, but tonight we have photographer and writer Jason Francisco with us. He's going to speak about the contemporary landscape of the Jewish past in Eastern Europe. An American Jew with deep experience in Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and Lithuania, Jason has been a keen observer of the ways cultures of remembering and forgetting interact. Jason's talk will feature key works in his artistic journey, including his critically acclaimed project, Alive and Destroyed, a mediation on the Holocaust in time, a fabulous book that we have here and that I've been able to see through, and you're going to see some photos from the book tonight during the presentation. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Jason Francisco. Jason.
Okay, thank you, Troy and Trent, and to the staff here at Candles and Terre Haute. Yes, I'm Jason Francisco, and I'd like to spend a little time with you tonight talking about thinking through memory and remembrance about the Jewish past in Eastern Europe and some of the complexities of inheriting it, or you could say more broadly, inheriting genocide. It seems a little fortuitous that we're here on May the 9th, which in the post-Soviet world is celebrated as Victory Day. And now we have a new war in the very bloodlands that Timothy Snyder speaks about, where the Holocaust itself occurred. Okay, I'll talk for a while tonight and show you some photographs, and then we can open it up to conversation after that. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah, okay, good. Good. Let's see. Trent, I'm having a little technical question here. This should be forwarding it, right?
Correct. Let me check here. Well, you're right that it's not doing so. One moment.
What's a presentation without a technical difficulty, right? There we are. Okay. All right, we can start here. View of my desk. A few months ago, my book, Alive and Destroyed, finally emerged into the world. A 10-year project, which was at the center of my life and work in Eastern Europe. The book is a collection of photographs, thousands of photographs that I made using a large format camera. There's my camera. I had it in my car, so I thought, oh, maybe you'd like to see my camera. So there it is. Along the way, I learned many things and I did many things to, in a sense, become able to do Alive and Destroyed. And I'd like to take you through a little bit of a journey of works and activities. For those of you who may not be thinking about genocide and the Holocaust, I might take just a moment to review some very basic things about the subject. This is a map of names that are too small to read. As you see, they're spread out across most of Europe, virtually the entirety of Europe, from France all the way into what is today Russia and Belarus. In 2013, as I've written here on the slide, the US Holocaust Museum released the research, the results of a research project that took them many years to do, in which they simply tried to count the number of sites that we, in which the events that we collectively called the Holocaust occurred. And when they started this project several years before, they thought they basically had them all at that point. The number at that point was about 6,500 sites. By 2013, that number shockingly had grown to over 42,500 sites. And they're not done counting. So in a certain way, if you were to think metaphorically of the Holocaust as beginning with Kristallnacht, the famous Night of the Broken Glass that happened in November 1938, if you were to think of the continent of Europe as covered by a single sheet of glass, and as if you were to think of the Holocaust as a hammer that smashed that glass, the shards of that smashing fell in every corner of occupied Europe, in every corner. Today, Holocaust historians are commonly, they will commonly divide the geography of the Holocaust into two broad divisions. One, which is called, or more and more commonly called, the area of the Holocaust by bullets. And the Holocaust by bullets was the murder, the physical murder of Jewish people in or near the places they actually lived. This was the earlier phase of the Holocaust. It began in earnest in the summer of 1941, when the Nazi government decided to abrogate the non-aggression treaty with the Soviet Union, and in June 1941 invaded the Soviet Union. And behind the lines of the invading German army were these mobile killing squads whose jobs were to round up and massacre Jewish people, to shoot them into pits in the places where they lived. This is how, for example, people in my own family died. Those who died in the Holocaust died that way. And there are thousands upon thousands upon thousands of such sites across, mostly across what was the Soviet Union. There's a contemporary organization called Yahad in Unum, which is attempting to do forensic investigation to actually find those places, and as much as is still possible, to locate exactly where they occurred and to collect any evidence that they can still find about what happened at that time. And Yahad has a constantly evolving interactive map in which you can trace their work. So each of these dots represents a site of massacre of Jews during the Holocaust by bullets. The colors represent sites whose information is not yet online, or sites whose information is online. This phase of the Holocaust, the earlier phase of the Holocaust that occurred in the East, is generally less well known to Western, to people in the West. For a lot of reasons, but mostly because during the Soviet period, information about it was simply harder to come by. And it's the second phase of the Holocaust, what you could call the Holocaust by gas, which turns out to be the better known aspect of the genocide. And this is the instead of the murder of people where they lived, this involved the transporting of people to centralized killing sites where people were murdered, usually in industrial fashion, through asphyxiation. And the roundup and detention of people in camps then became part of a larger process of deportation and transportation of people into killing centers. This is the part of the Holocaust that people tend to think of, I think, more reflexively, to the point that you know, for many people, when they think about the Holocaust, the first place that they'll think of is Auschwitz, the largest of the killing centers, where more than 1 million people were murdered. But the truth is much more complicated in the sense that over time, I think that as we've inherited the Holocaust over generations, we've become more and more accustomed to thinking in a more decentralized way about the Holocaust in a less reductive way. So that Auschwitz, in fact, stands for certain aspects of the Holocaust, but there are many things in the Holocaust that are not captured or really registered very well by the Auschwitz experience. And the decentralized approach to the Holocaust is what I think is really the leading edge of work. And this is my own leading edge. It's the scholarship that is proceeding from this decentralized approach, which is really my own point of departure. So that over a series of about 10 years, a series of trips, I began to use the geography as my own point of entry into this decentralized understanding of the Holocaust's history. And I worked in more or less this footprint, which is the epicenter of the Holocaust. It's more or less divided between the Holocaust by bullets and the Holocaust by gas. And my work ranged over many countries, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, Romania, Austria, Hungary, a little bit of work in Germany. The center of my work was really, I would say, here. This is the historical province of Galicia, which is today split between Poland and Western Ukraine. This is sort of the center of much of my work, but basically from Riga in the north to Bucharest in the south and Berlin to Kharkov in the east is really the area that I worked in. And over that 10 years of time, of the 42,000, say 500 sites that the US Holocaust Museum has named or identified, I've worked in maybe 300 of them, many of them multiple times, a fraction of what exists. If I spent my entire life working, I would never come close to understanding the full extent experientially as one person. I would never come close to experiencing the full extent of what there is to understand. On the other hand, I should say that it's a little bit, once you start really thinking about this issue, it's a little bit hard to tell the difference between a Holocaust site and a Holocaust non-site. That's a question that we can talk about if anyone is interested. I have some text that seems to be covered up by the screen here. Okay, I'll do the best I can. There are some thoughts and ideas that are sitting behind my work, and without dwelling too long on them, I thought I might introduce you a little bit to the kind of thinking which is pushing me forward. I would make a proposition, having been to these hundreds of sites in the geography of the Holocaust, I would make a proposition about what a Holocaust site is today, what it is when you go look at it in person directly. And there are three things really, if I had to boil it down, that characterize these kinds of sites. One of them is that they're sites where historical testimony is conflicted. Knowledge, to the extent that we have it, is often unreconciled to perception. What you know and what you see do not correspond. Number two, these are locations where the urge to remember strangely does not have urgency often. Or you might say that the need to remember lacks necessity. There's a very distinct kind of ambivalence when it comes to the urgency and the need to remember. Number three, I would say that there are places where loss has what seems like a kind of potency or agency or influence. Loss is paradoxically active and activated. If I'm right to say that, to observe these things, then I have come to think of a distinction between what I call memory and what I would call remembrance. These are two words that in normal English are more or less synonymous with each other, but I think in my own way of understanding things have become, they stand for quite distinct approaches to what it means to try to remember something in these kinds of locations. So that memory, I think of as what we mean when we talk about our concern with the accuracy of our representations of the past, as against remembrance, which I think is more concerned with the adequacy of our imagination for the past. Memory is concerned with what you might call the past on the past's own terms, as against remembrance, which is concerned with the past on the terms of our present. And memory, I would say, is often in the service of nationalism or what I would call competitive victimhood, as against remembrance, which is often something that rejects the politics of resentment or the ranking of historical crimes and atrocities. I want to show you, before showing you a few pictures from Alive and Destroyed, I'd like to show you some examples of what I mean by the complications of these locations of genocidal memory. These are a few photographs from different projects that I did along the way. And maybe we can start here in the Polish city of Łódź, which was during the war, the site of the longest lasting ghetto that existed. And it was a very famous ghetto also, and comparatively well known because there was the Jewish Council took great trouble to document exactly what was happening. And those documents exist in pretty complete form. So we know a lot of things about what happened in the Łódź ghetto, among which we have a really very remarkable visual document. Is one of the very few examples of what it meant, what it looked like, what ghetto life looked like from the perspective of a Jewish photographer. Most of the photography that we have of the Holocaust is not made by Jews. It was made by perpetrators for various purposes that have been revised in our own interpretations, correctly revised. But perpetrators are responsible for the vast majority of the visual evidence that we have. But Łódź is a case where we have a remarkable document made by an imprisoned Jew who, actually there were a couple of photographers working together, but the one that I'm interested most in was named Mendel Grossman, who was working for the Jewish Council and actually against the explicit instructions of the Jewish Council decided to photograph what was going on for the sake of making a historical record. Mendel Grossman's work has been a point of fascination to me for a very long time. And without telling you his whole story, it's really rather hard to know the extent of what he did. Only fragments of his work remain. But he shows us what it meant to live in the Łódź ghetto, what it meant to be so cold that you can't stop to eat a bowl of soup, to be so hungry that even the cold was not enough to stop you sitting on a snowbank to eat your soup, for example. He shows us informationally what happened, many things about what happened. He also shows us psychologically something about what vulnerability meant and what living by your wits meant. I decided in 2010 to go to Łódź to look at the places of Mendel Grossman's work and the Łódź ghetto myself. And I went back many years to the northern section of Łódź, the neighborhood called Bałty, where the ghetto existed. And I photographed with two cameras. I photographed with a a digital camera, and I photographed with a large format, an old-fashioned 19th century style camera. This is, as I showed you, this is my camera. And I made two kinds of pictures at this time. And I put them into a kind of, you could say, dialogue with each other. You'll see that there are the color pictures of the digital pictures, the black and white pictures are the large format pictures. Let me show you a few of these pictures without narrating them, just to ask you to look at the dialogue that's going on here. Try to absorb it a little bit. My thinking here, although I don't think I can explain the pictures to you. As I say that, I'm thinking of the poet Robert Frost. There's a nice anecdote about Robert Frost being at a reading, and somebody asked him a question. Mr. Frost, could you explain the meaning of that poem? And Frost's reply was, I'm not sure I get the question. You want me to say it worse? So I can't tell you exactly in that spirit what these pictures mean, except that I can tell you that I'm attempting to enter this place from two doors at once. One is the door of its contemporary direct, the direct contemporary witness. The other one is the door of speculation and memory, that which is indirectly available or speculatively available, or that which comes to meaning by association. And so by putting one thing into a kind of interrogative response to the other thing, what I'm hoping to do is to introduce a sense that the place that we're standing in has something going on beneath the surfaces. Something is going on behind the surfaces or under the surfaces, which is palpable, but not exactly verifiable. It doesn't exist as a state of information exactly, and yet it's also not just a dream. There's something about the presence of the past which is with you when you stand in Bauti, when you stand in a street which was the ghetto. By picturing the street like this and picturing a current resident in a different way, what I'm hoping is that the act of deflection from one kind of picture to the other begins to summon a sense of imagination for what isn't directly visible. In some of the cases, these pictures have very, very, very direct references to the history of the ghetto. This site was the place where the head of the Judenrat, Chaim Rumkowski, delivered a famous speech in which he demanded that the residents of the ghetto, he demanded that they give him their children for deportation to Chelmno, the camp Chelmno, which is where most of the Jews of Łódź were murdered. He was a deeply unpopular person, and this was an extremely controversial demand that he made. He stood there to make that speech. Well, how does a photographer, or how does a contemporary witness of this place begin to possibly receive that testimony, the testimony of that site of standing there with those people. That's my problem. Let me show you another example. Here in the city of Lviv. Well, this is the Russian name for the city, Lvov. Currently, the Ukrainian name of the city, Lviv, is the name that I normally use. It had many names. In Polish, it was Lvov. In Yiddish, it was Lemberg. German, it was Lemberg. In Yiddish, it was Lemberg. The Jewish community in Lviv goes back almost 1,000 years. And it was one of the very most important sites of Jewish life in Eastern Europe. And the cemetery, the cemetery, the oldest Jewish cemetery was hundreds of years old. And it was really a pantheon of Jewish life. It was an incredibly important place for Jewish communal memory and also for Jewish religious activity. 100 years ago or so, it was studied extensively by the Polish Jewish historian Meyer Bauerban, who contracted a photographer from Lemberg, one of the best professional photographers in the city, whose name is Menachem Muntz. And together they began to study the Besoilem, the Beis Oilem, as it was called, the old Jewish cemetery in Lviv. They studied the headstones, they documented them. Well, during the German occupation, the old Jewish cemetery was attacked and partially dismantled, along with the murder of the community. And during the Soviet period, that dismantlement continued, and all the tombstones were pulled out of the ground. Virtually all of them were pulled out of the ground. They were repurposed, you could say, used for building materials. And a market was built on the top of the old Jewish cemetery. This is the market. If you go to Lviv today, there's no sign, there's no historical marker, there's nothing that tells you that this market was the site of the old Jewish cemetery, or that there are bones beneath your feet, even today. Tens of thousands of bones are lying beneath the feet of the people who shop and work daily at this market. This discrepancy between the historical reality and the contemporary reality was the site of another photographic dialogue. Let me show you, and in this case, it's a simple dialogue that involves reappropriating Muntz's photographs and putting them together with my own photographs made in the market, the Krakowski market as it's called. I'll show you these photographs also without commentary. Again, I'm sorry, you here in the room can't see the photographs entirely, but okay. This project goes under the working title, The Everyday Life of Mutilated History. And my thinking here is to stage a kind of confrontation, between one era of this site's actuality and another era by way of photography. From time to time, fragments of the tombstones from the Besoilem are turned up in the city. And there's a little strip of grass that sits behind, the cemetery was built later, there was a hospital built next to the cemetery. And there's a little strip of grass behind the hospital, which still stands. And from time to time, when there are fragments of matsevas that appear, they're taken to that little strip of grass and put down. And you may find them from time to time if you walk around back there, although sometimes people will just use them to eat their lunch. And this is an overview of the cemetery today. This is the dome of the Jewish hospital that still stands next to it. Let me give you one more example. This time in Krakow, in what used to be far southwestern Poland. It's today the center of southern Poland. Those of you who've been there maybe know that the center of it's a very deeply historical city, a remarkable city, and its Jewish community also was very old. It's kind of the cultural capital of Poland, you could say, and its old town, which is right here, is one of the most remarkable places in Europe. It's a totally beautiful place. About 4 kilometers to the south of it was the site of the large camp that the Germans built for the city of Krakow, which is known as Płaszów, after this district of the city. It's about the same size as the old town, and in the contemporary geography of Krakow, it's sort of its altar site. This is the center of everything. This is the center of nothing. It's the sort of a hole almost in the middle of the city. It was the site of what became the camp was a Jewish cemetery before the war. And interestingly, just a few years ago, somebody came to the head of the Jewish community, the Gmina in Krakow, with a book. They didn't know what it was. And it turned out to be a burial registry of thousands of graves that were there at the site of the what became the camp. I photographed this book a few years ago. The camp existed from the summer of 1942 until January 1945. It came to occupy almost 200 acres, and there were some 30,000 prisoners who went through it. Over 200 buildings were built there. The death toll was somewhere in the range of 10,000 people. The camp's victims were buried in mass graves all over the site. Most of them were exhumed before the Germans evacuated Krakow and burned, and the ashes were distributed around the camp, making the entire campsite into a vast cemetery. This is what the camp looked like when it was operational. This is what the place looks like today. I've spent a lot of time thinking about Płaszów, about this neglected, abandoned site, this no man's land in the city. And my project, my visual thinking about this has taken 2 forms. One of them is a very careful look at the land itself, a series of landscape photographs made in all seasons with a large camera that allows very, very, very descriptive images of what the misshapeness of the earth looks like, of how it is that the earth of genocide grows and decays and regrows and decays, the sense of the ecological lessons or the spiritual lessons maybe that the ecology of the earth of genocide will teach. And on the other hand, I've been very interested in making portraits of people who I encounter at the camp and the things that they do there. For example, this is Zbigniew, who works to cut the grass in what was the old Jewish cemetery. who does this. He's a Krakow Jew who does this just because he needs to. He shows up and he cuts the grass. Others are neighbors who come to the place to contemplate their lives or time or the past itself. Children grow up in the camp. This is one of the main sites where bodies were burned, and also has become one of the main gathering sites for locals in the area of the camp. You also see people doing things at Płaszów that you would never see happening, I think, at Auschwitz or any other camp which is under the authority of some museum or cultural institution. Płaszów was under no such authority until a couple of years ago. Now there is an intention to build a museum at the camp. We'll see if that happens and in what form it takes. But otherwise, the camp is often used for all kinds of other activities, like sunbathing, for example, drinking, barbecuing, partying, playing frisbee. And I've seen lots and lots of things, people having sex, taking drugs, all kinds of things happen there. Płaszów is a great example of what I think of as this conflictual geography of genocide. So my own work in this area started really in the 1990s. I began to go to Eastern Europe to try to think through what it means to inherit a genocide, which is, I think, is a generational problem, actually, a multi-generational problem. There are some kinds of experiences that cannot be inherited by a single generation. They can't be understood or figured out. And I think that this is one of those. The first book that I did, which I published in 2006, was titled Far From Zion, Jews, Diaspora, Memory. And in this book, the central question for me was really the question of what I call the Jewish nothing. The nothingness that the Holocaust has left in its wake, the rupture that exists in consciousness and in time, how to give it shape. In a sense, against the idea that when we think about the Holocaust, we should focus on the traces of the Holocaust itself or the traces of life that existed before the Holocaust. Those are very important. But the nothingness that the Holocaust created is also very important. And I think that a better, more supple form of remembrance is one that can face the question of nothingness directly and attempt to try to handle it on its own terms. If I were to think about methods for doing this, I might present it sort of schematically this way, in which we can talk about documentary and poetical means and documentary and poetical ends, and artists or researchers can have a choice of ways of working, sometimes to align means and ends, sometimes deliberately not to align means and ends. And in my case, that's really the method. Using poetical means for documentary ends and using documentary means for poetical ends. To try to do both of those things simultaneously seems to me to be the way forward in terms of dealing with this vexed question of nothingness. So Alive and Destroyed arose really as a response to what I couldn't figure out in the first book that I did. And if I had to name my tasks with this book, I would say that these pretty much this is it. I wanted to disperse and to decentralize remembrance of the Holocaust. This is just in keeping with contemporary scholarship. I wanted to find a way to de-objectify the memory of the Holocaust. That is, to allow incomprehension and argument and the dispute between loss and reclamation, the volatile mixture that you actually feel when you go to these places. I wanted to allow that to come into the story of what it means to really wrestle with the Holocaust as an inheritance. And I wanted to find a visual language to do that against the traditional documentary approach, which is to create a kind of surrogate mastery over something visually, to create a sense that you've captured, you've imprisoned or captured something in awareness that you can then hand off to somebody else. I wanted to create a more porous and difficult kind of imagery that allowed both for understanding and non-understanding to have a place. Or as I think of it, and put it in the title of my book, images that would allow for a meditation on the Holocaust, not a statement of meaning or lack of meaning about the Holocaust, but a meditation, images that would prompt such a meditation. And it took me a really long time to figure out this visual language. Eventually I did. It's a very idiosyncratic visual language. I have not seen anyone work with something like this visual language before. I had to figure it out myself. And here is, again, I'm sorry that you can't see, those of you in the room can't see everything that I'm showing you, but here's kind of a display of the differences between what you might call a conventional photograph and the visual language that I worked out. The conventional photograph is sharp from corner to corner and from near to far. Things are discernible, nameable, in a sense, comprehensible. In the visual language that I used for this project, most of the image exists in this inchoate form, this blurred form, with a corridor of focus that runs, that cuts through that at some angle in space. Here's a picture of a photograph made with my small camera as against the way that I would render it with the large camera, to create this more diffuse and volumetric sense that has, in a sense, this exchange going on between that which is sharp and claimed and that which is released and inchoate. I could mimic this with a digital camera, kind of, but not really. Really the only way to do this is to use the tool there and to do it organically and gesturally. So when I published Alive and Destroyed, I wrote, there are 118 photographs. That number is deliberate. The number 18 in Jewish tradition is an important symbolic number standing for life. So I chose 118 of some 3,000 pictures that comprise the whole project. Originally, I thought that I would put them together with short essays. And I wrote those essays that would speak about each of these sites. The editor at Daylight Books suggested to me that that was a mistake, that weighted the book far too much on the side of information, and that I should let the experience with the photographs be organically itself. And I think that he was exactly right about that. And so the book that I have here has quite a lot of text that I've written for it, including a translation of it begins with a translation of a poem by Arne Zeitlin, an important Yiddish writer, and then later there's quite a long essay in the back that includes some of the texts that I might have written. But for the most part, the book proceeds with silence and without text. There's a list of place names at the back in which you can identify the place if you really want to. If you really want to know where these pictures were made, you can do it. But each of the pictures, in a sense, stands for more than itself. So in that spirit, let me show you, without commentary, some of the photographs from Alive and Destroyed. And you can absorb them right now for whatever they are for you. I'll say only that each of these pictures was made at one of those 42,500 sites.
Someone get the video.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yes. This is Rumbula, which has a connection to the display here. Outside of Riga, right? Chihai. This is Plashev. This is the last slide. So thank you for your attention. And I'll be happy to answer any questions from anyone here or in the Zoom. Yes.
I have a question about the pair of photographs that you showed. Where one was photorealistic and the other was the image.
Should I go back to it?
Sure. Is
This
that
one.
Babanyar?
Yes, it is.
Okay. That's not within the memorial area.
I know that.
Okay, where is it?
Where is this?
That.
If you know the territory of, do you know the territory of Babi Yar just specifically? So can I put your question into broader context for the audience?
Yeah.
There's been a lot of, Babi Yar was the site, or Babin Yar in Ukrainian, is the site of where the Jews of Kiev were murdered in a ravine that was then on the outskirts of the city. And many others were murdered there also over the course of several years. And after the war, the site was changed repeatedly, built over, and there's been a great deal of forensic activity trying to recover information about where these massacres, which were in total more than speculated as to be more than 100,000 people, where these actually occurred. And it's really only in the last 3-4 years that significant progress has been made in terms of locating the exact location of where the massacres took place. And as far as we know now, the site where they took place is under a big road and under a park. Part of it is under a subway station. When I first went to Babi Yar more than 20 years ago, there's one of the memorials there are several of them there now, but one of them is a big menorah. And there's a ravine that was directly behind that menorah, kind of, if you follow a trailhead back into the forest, you come to this ravine. And when I first discovered this place, when I first went there in the early 2000s, I knew that there was a question about where the massacre sites were. I knew the landscape had changed, but this was the site that spoke most directly to me, without knowing whether it was exactly the spot or not exactly the spot. It was the spot that spoke to my imagination of what the place was like. And I still think it is, quite honestly. I made this picture in 2017, both of these pictures in 2017, already having learned a lot about what had changed in the place. And I made photographs at the subway station, and I made photographs at the park. I made other photographs, and they're not wrong. Those photographs are not wrong, but they also didn't speak to me about the historical geography of the place as much as this place, which probably is not the actual place. But this place spoke to in terms of the question of remembrance, this place was closer than the actual place of memory, if I was to be informationally specific. Maybe I'm wrong about that. I can't tell you that it's right or wrong. It's simply the way it was for me.
I agree with you. I saw the area in 1999. And at that time, there was a small monument that simply referred to the victims of the Great Patriotic War.
Right.
And then we walked some distance and saw, I think I saw that.
Yeah.
Which is why the moment I saw that in your book, I said, yes, that's it.
That's it. And there's if you're interested in this story, there's been some very interesting writing just recently. There's an essay in the New Yorker from a few issues ago by Masha Gessen, who was writing about the ongoing question of the politics of memory and the revitalization of memory in the context of the current war in Ukraine. And there's a big and controversial new memorial that's planned by a famous or maybe infamous film director, Ukrainian film director, Ilya Khrzhanovsky. And now the plans for the building of that memorial are off, but it's an interesting moment to consider the question of what it means to try to remember incompletely remembered past atrocity in the context of the now unfolding atrocities that are going on in the Russian war in Ukraine. And really there are, as I understand it, there are sort of two sides to this debate. One side will say that the new atrocities, in a sense, supersede the old ones. And the other side will say that the new atrocities make the old ones even more pressing and relevant, and that the creation of a democratic culture requires integrating different eras of historical atrocity in Ukraine. Anyway, that's an ongoing debate. But a lot of it is centered around Babi Yar. A lot of it is centered around Babi Yar. Are there other thoughts or questions?
We have a question from
Yes.
online.
Yes.
Rabbi Mel Young says, love your charts, tables on memory, remembrance, and documentary, etc. Is it possible to receive copies, or are they in your works?
Yes. Thank you, Mel Young. Write to me and I'll just send them to you. They're not published anywhere. They're certainly not in my book. Yes.
Yeah. The difference between the Holocaust of bullets and the Holocaust of gas.
Yeah.
When I see the outline you had on bullets, frankly, one I've never heard of before, but are the numbers then way different from 6 million?
No. I mean, the number 6 million is already a kind of approximate number, and this in a way is I think the bookend to your, I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Dan, and who are you? Anna. So Anna's question about site specificity is maybe bookended by your question about numbers specificity. And I think that in a certain way, both of them, there's an ambiguity that's built into both of them. And so, you know, contemporary scholarship continues to revise estimates, approximations, but no, it doesn't revise those general numbers. What it does is specify those general numbers. As far as I understand it, I'm not a historian. But that's my understanding. Yeah.
Is there one location that you found yourself drawn to more than others, or one spot that was more impactful for you? Many. I mean, most of these places I have been to multiple times because I couldn't figure them out in one encounter, or they didn't give themselves up to me, or whatever you want to call it, in one encounter. Let me show you an example of I'll show you an example of one picture this one that you might have noticed. So to tell you in brief the story that's not written next to the photograph that appears in the book, in Lviv, the Germans invaded in the early days of July 1941, and almost immediately organized a pogrom against the Jewish population. There were about 4,000 people who were killed within a couple of days. There were 3 sites around the city of Lviv, which were the main killing sites during the Lviv pogrom. And they were all prisons that were situated within the city. In one of these prisons, what had been established as a prison during the Austrian period, that became a prison that remained a prison during the Polish period after the First World War, when Lviv became part of newly recreated Poland. And when the Soviets invaded in 1939, it became a Soviet prison. And when the Germans invaded in 1941, it became a German prison. And then when the Soviets invaded again, it became a Soviet prison. And then after the end of the Soviet Union, it became a Ukrainian prison. And it was a site of imprisonment for every regime that was there in the city. When the Germans invaded and they staged a pogrom, they immediately claimed that the Jews were responsible for a massacre inside the Lądź-Kochów prison, and that this was the reason why the pogrom needed to happen, as a kind of a ritual of collective retribution against the Jews. In fact, the massacre had been conducted by the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, but the Jews were forced to bury those people who the Soviets had murdered, and then the Jews themselves were shot into the same pits. Later, others, prisoners of war and other people, were shot into the same pits. And so there were a lot of bodies buried in the yard of the Lunskoho prison. The prison stopped functioning in the 90s, and it was kind of left in the state that it was in at that time. It was sort of pickled. And then it was opened as a prison museum in the early 2000s. And in 2014, I was living in Lviv during the Maidan Revolution, the Revolution of Dignity, that toppled the pro-Russian government, that then provoked the invasion of Crimea and the slow war in the eastern part of Ukraine, in the Donbass, which has now become the site of a lot of the current atrocities and violence that we're seeing. But back then, when the war started in 2014, one of the things that the Ukrainian government did was to decide to unbury bodies in the Lunskoho prison yard, under the auspices that they were they were retrieving the bodies of Ukrainian nationalists who had been killed by the Soviets. This was not a proper archaeological dig. It was really kind of a show dig, you could say. And I talked my way in to the dig. For almost a week with that camera, I was knee deep in mud as they pulled one corpse after another out of the mud, threw the bones in bags. Some of them still, like this one, still has shoes on, you can see. And I realized that who were these corpses? Well, we don't know who they are. They could be Jews. They could well be Jews murdered in that pogrom, but they might be Poles or Ukrainian nationalists. They might be anti-communists. There could be many, many people who were there buried in that prison yard. And my inability to tell you to identify who those bones belong to, the fact that that person could have been the victim of any of these brutal regimes, to me speaks to the open attitude, the certain kind of open attitude that I have about Holocaust remembrance. Is that too long an answer to your question?
Good, thank you. Jason, for those people online, is there a place where they can find your book, order your book?
Yes. Well, you can order my book virtually anywhere that books are sold. You can also buy a copy from me personally if you want. And I also have a deluxe edition in which the book plus a print or a set of prints is available, original prints that I've made. You can find my contact information at Emory University or on my website, which is myname.net. And I'll be happy to speak to anybody about that if anyone wants to buy a copy of the book. Yeah. Yes.
How hard is it to get film for that camera?
Not hard if you know where to go. Pretty hard if you don't know where to go. I get it. Any professional camera store will sell it to you. They keep it in stock because there are a bunch of crazy people like me who still want it. Yes. Yes. And for anybody who's here, I have a few books with me if anyone would like to buy them. All right. Are there any last questions then? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jason. Again, yes, please. And thank you all for joining us, both in person and online. to let you all know this webinar has been recorded and will be up on the candlesholocaustmuseum.org website in just a matter of days. So again, this concludes our speaker series for the school year, and we look to pick it back up in the fall when the school year kind of starts up again. So we hope you enjoy your summer, and stay tuned on social media or online at our webpage to find out the latest details into when our next speaker series will be taking place. So with that, I bid you adieu. Have a great evening, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.